Welcome to the next section, which is configuring your project overview, DBT settings, and Git commands. We're going to take a look at each of these things. So in this first lesson, what we'll do is we'll take a look at the project overview. We'll review some of the default directories, files, and configurations just to give you kind of a sense of bearings of what's going on here in a project before you start adding anything to it. So I'm back here in Visual Studio Code, and let's open up our project here. And so by default, we see there's a handful of directories and files that were added here. These are things that were just created by default when we did the initialization. So starting from the top, we have a folder just called analyses, and there's nothing in here. And this is really just a place for you to put random queries or files, whatever you want to, just kind of ad hoc analysis. There's really nothing more to that you would really need to do there. Macros. When you hear macros, we're going to talk about each of these things more, but a macro is essentially a function in a sense. You could think of it like a user defined function. These will be reusable bits of code that you can use throughout your project, and this is where they're going to be stored. Models. Now, models are really the core of DBT, and by models, generally speaking, they're going to be the queries that we write to create something new. It's the transformation logic that gets then built as something new. Maybe it's a table or a view, and all the logic would be in here. It gives you a few examples, and this is where they would live in this models directory. Seeds are going to be kind of reference data that we can add. There'll be CSV files ultimately that will add, and you can deploy to your project and use them almost like a lookup table. Snapshots are next, and they're kind of what it sounds like. It's taking snapshots in a point in time of your data, and you can almost create what looks like a slowly changing dimension table through here. So you can configure it to look at certain values and say, when was this record updated? And it'll give you, timestamp dates to when certain values were updated. And tests, just like it sounds, you can write different types of tests for your project. Now getting to one of the most important files of your project is the dbt project.yaml file. And there's a lot of default comments in here, but ultimately this is your main file for your project that everything kind of veers off from. So at the top here, we can see we have the name, and this was based on what we set up before. So it pre-populated it with a name, version 1 and config version 2. Don't worry too much about this. This is by default, and I don't think you'll ever need to change that. And if you do, I'm sure DBT Labs will make an announcement. You can just keep that as is. Profile, this is configured to the default profile that we created. Remember, in our profiles.yaml, it created one called DBT training. This profile in particular we'll touch on in the next lesson. Here is the default paths for certain things. So we have these concepts of models, analysis, tests, macros, etc. All these things are fundamental DBT concepts. And by default, they're put into these folders. So it's all set to match here. But in theory, you could change these. And then if you wanted to change, create a new directory, call it something completely different, you could add it here. You would just have to update it here so that it knows to look there. But in my experience, you probably won't need to ever touch any of this. It would have to be kind of a one-off scenario. Target path, this is what's going to store compiled code. So when you run DBT, it's really ultimately just compiling code and then sending it to Snowflake to run. But you can see what it actually compiled by looking under a target. Clean directories, this is there's a clean command that allows you to essentially delete everything, and by default it'll do these. And then down here, this is what is going to be more interesting because you can add configurations to models. And one of the great things about DBT and the way that it's set up that we'll learn about is it's heavily reliant on directories. And so you can make directories and group things together and then have certain configurations or attributes for all of them by setting them all in your project level. So you don't have to go into each individual one and set a certain, parameter or a configuration. You can do it here. So in this scenario, for example, everything that we would put here would apply to models.example, because this is models in this project example. If we go models, this is the example directory, and it's saying how it's going to materialize. It's a certain configuration. that we'll discuss. And all of this here is in YAML. So we'll have a brief intro to YAML here shortly, but this is one of the most important files that you'll work with, dbtproject.yaml. We'll get used to this. So what we'll do here, let's just to keep this simple. You can hang on to this if you want, but I think it can get a little bit noisy. I'm going to delete all these comments. Then you can see, okay, this is all it is. Save this. It's not as intimidating when you see it like this, in my opinion. So that's an overview of the full project, and in particular also that dbtproject.yaml, which is a really important file. So in the next lesson, what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit more about this profile, how to add another one, and how this all plays together. And then we'll move on to some Git commands.